Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here today. We meet during what is the greatest global food security crisis of our time. It's a crisis that we all know has been building for years, driven in part by the pandemic, driven by an accelerating climate crisis. Between 2016 and 2021, the number of people living in acute food insecurity, the level when a person's inability to consume adequate food puts their lives or livelihoods in immediate danger, that has skyrocketed from 108 million people to 161 million people around the world. It was this growing crisis that led Ambassador Thomas Greenfield to make the nexus between food security and conflict the focus of a UN Security Council meeting that she chaired in March of last year. And it's why the United States made robust commitments at the Secretary General's UN Food Systems Summit last September. All of that was before the Russian government's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, which, according to the World Bank, may drive 40 million additional people worldwide into extreme poverty and food insecurity this year. Indeed, every driver of the crisis that we'll discuss today has been made worse by President Putin's war of choice. That's why we thought it was so important to convene this high-level group, to put a brighter spotlight on the devastating impact of this crisis and to marshal the global effort that is needed to address it. This is something we're intently focused on every day at the State Department and across the United States government. But it's a crisis that demands a global response. Tomorrow, I'll have the opportunity to lead a session in the Security Council on how conflicts like this one are fueling food insecurity and how rising food insecurity is threatening peace and security around the globe, problems that we have to tackle as parts of a whole. Today, in our gathering, we want to focus on what we can do to save lives now and address the long-term drivers of this problem. I'll start by offering 4 suggestions, at least on the part of the United States, about what we can do. But having said that, this meeting is really about hearing the perspectives of a range of colleagues and countries, both on how this crisis is affecting lives in your respective countries, but also on what we can do together to address it. First, from our perspective, we need countries to step up with substantial new contributions to fill the gaps faced by humanitarian organizations and agencies that are battling food insecurity, which are forcing humanitarian groups to make incredibly wrenching decisions about when and where to cut life-saving assistance. The cost of doing business for vital organizations like the World Food Program, the Food and Agriculture Organization, UNICEF and others, the cost of doing business is going up. We have to help them continue to do their business. In particular, as well, countries with significant grain and fertilizer reserves, as well as those with financial resources, need to step up and do it fast. The United States has announced more than $2.3 billion in new funding for emergency food assistance to meet global humanitarian needs since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Today, given the urgency of the crisis, we're announcing another $215 million in new emergency food assistance. And we'll do much more. We expect our Congress very soon to approve approximately $5.5 billion in additional funding for humanitarian assistance and food security. Governments and international organizations can also come together to compel the Russian Federation to create corridors so that food and other vital supplies can safely leave Ukraine by land or by sea. There are an estimated 22 million tons of grain sitting in silos in Ukraine right now, food that could immediately go toward helping those in need if it can simply get out of the country. Second, we believe we must address the global fertilizer shortage. Consider Africa, where the cost of fertilizer has already quadrupled since the start of the pandemic and has skyrocketed further since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. One way to address this is by creating incentives for countries to produce more fertilizer, as the United States is doing by committing $500 million to boost U.S. production. We can also help farmers maximize fertilizer efficiency, learning from advances made by countries like Ethiopia. Some have tried to blame the sanctions imposed on the Russian Federation by the United States and many other countries for worsening this crisis. This is false. When we impose sanctions on Russia in order to end the war as quickly as possible, we deliberately and carefully created exceptions for agricultural goods and fertilizer. We're working every day to get countries any information or assistance they need to ensure that sanctions are not preventing food or fertilizer from leaving Russia or anywhere else. As with its decision to start this unjustified war, responsibility for the disruption of these supplies and the suffering that it's causing around the world lies squarely and solely with the Russian government. Third, we believe we must increase investments in agricultural capacity and resilience. That's what the United States is doing through our Feed the Future program, which will invest $5 billion in more than 35 countries over 5 years, as well as our longstanding support of international agricultural research centers. It's also the focus of the Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate, which we launched a year ago with the United Arab Emirates to try to turbocharge investment in climate-smart agriculture. Fourth, we believe that we have to help poor and vulnerable populations bear the colossal impact of this crisis. International financial institutions have a critical role to play in doing this. That's why our Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, convened a session with the leadership of the international financial institutions just a few weeks ago and pushed for the development of the International Financial Institution Action Plan to address food insecurity, which was released on the margins of today's G7 financial ministerial. Finally, if we want to save lives, we all have to be willing to shoulder added risk. Last week, President Biden traveled to a family farm in Illinois. He talked about how farms, like the one he visited, are working to double crop, harvesting 2 crops from the same field in the same year. Now, this is something that doesn't always work. The growing seasons are short, weather doesn't always cooperate, but, as the President said, that's a risk we have to take.
Leaders told me that because of the war in Ukraine, on top of the other crises they face, they fear this dangerous situation could tip into catastrophe. They are not alone. Global hunger levels are at a new high. In just 2 years, the number of severely food insecure people has doubled, from 135 million pre-pandemic to 276 million today. More than 500,000 people are living in famine conditions, an increase of more than 500% since 2016. As we will discuss in the Security Council tomorrow, these frightening figures are inextricably linked with conflict as both cause and effect. If we do not feed people, we feed conflict. The climate emergency is another driver of global hunger. Over the past decade, 1.7 billion people have been affected by extreme weather and climate-related disasters. The economic shock caused by COVID-19 pandemic has compounded food insecurity, reducing incomes and disrupting supply chains. An uneven recovery from the pandemic has already put many developing countries on the brink of debt default and restricted access to financial markets. And now, the Russian invasion in Ukraine is amplifying and accelerating all these factors: climate change, COVID-19, and inequality. It threatens to tip tens of millions of people over the edge into food insecurity, followed by malnutrition, mass hunger, and famine in a crisis that could last for years. Excellencies, between them, Ukraine and Russia produce almost a third of the world's wheat and barley and half of its sunflower oil. Russia and Belarus are the world's number 2 and 3 producers of potash, a key ingredient of fertilizer. In the past year, global food prices have risen by nearly 1/3, fertilizer by more than half, and oil prices by almost 2/3. Most developing countries lack the fiscal space to cushion the blow of these huge increases. Many cannot borrow because markets are closed to them. Those that are able to borrow are charged with high interest rates that put them at risk of debt distress and default. If high fertilizer prices continue, Today's crisis in grain and cooking oil could affect many other foods, including rice, impacting billions of people in Asia and the Americas. High rates of hunger have a devastating impact on individuals, families, and societies. Children may suffer the lifetime effects of stunting. Millions of women and children will become malnourished. Girls will be pulled from school and forced to work or get married, and families will embark on dangerous journeys across continents just to survive. Excellencies, ending hunger is within our reach. There is enough food in our world now for everyone if we act together. But unless we solve this problem today, we face the specter of global food shortage in the coming months. I see 5 urgent steps for governments, international financial institutions, and others to solve the short-term crisis and prevent long-term catastrophe. First, we must urgently reduce the pressure on markets by increasing supplies of food and fertilizers. There should be no restriction on exports, and surpluses must be made available to those most in need. But let's be clear, there is no effective solution to the food crisis without reintegrating Ukraine's food production, as well as the food and fertilizer produced by Russia and Belarus, into world markets despite the war. Russia must permit the safe and secure export of grain stored in Ukrainian ports. Alternative transportation routes can be explored, even if we know that by itself they will not be enough to solve the problem. And Russian food and fertilizers must have unrestricted access to world markets without indirect impediments. I have been in intense contact on this issue at the senior leadership level with the Russian Federation, Ukraine, Turkey, the United States, the European Union, and several other key countries. I am hopeful, but there is still a long way to go. The complex security, economic, and financial implications require goodwill on all sides for a package deal to be reached. I will not go into details because public statements could undermine the chances of success. Second, social protection systems need to cover everyone in need with the right combinations of food, cash, and support for water, sanitation, nutrition, and livelihoods, which in turn means third, finance is essential. Developing countries must have access to liquidity so that they can provide social protection to everyone in need. International financial institutions need to step in with generous investments to prevent a global debt crisis. There is no answer to the food crisis without an answer to the finance crisis. Official development assistance is more necessary than ever. Diverting it to other priorities is not an option while the world is on the brink of mass hunger. Fourth, governments must bolster agricultural production and invest in resilient food systems that protect smallholder food producers. At today's prices, farmers cannot afford seeds, fuel, and fertilizers. Governments must be able to support them with subsidies and connect them to markets. Fifth, humanitarian operations must be fully funded to prevent famine and reduce hunger. Humanitarian organizations have a proven track record of preventing famine, most recently in South Sudan and Yemen. But they need resources, and those resources must be used for maximum good by exempting humanitarian food purchases from taxes, sanctions, and other restrictions. Excellencies, we are closely monitoring the global food security outlook and using our convening power to push for immediate steps. The Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy, and Finance is tackling the impact of the crisis on vulnerable people, identifying and pushing for solutions. The food crisis has no respect for borders, and no country can overcome it alone. Our only chance of lifting millions of people out of hunger is to act together, urgently, and with solidarity. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary General, thank you very much for your important words and also for the very concrete suggestions and ideas that you put on the table. It's a pleasure now for me to give the floor to my friend, the representative from Senegal and current African Union President.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur le
Thank you
secrétaire
very
d'État
much indeed,
Blinken,
Mr.
Monsieur le secrétaire général des
Secretary
Nations
of
Unies, mes
State,
chers
Mr.
collègues
Secretary
ministres,
General, dear
Mesdames et Messieurs,
colleagues,
Monsieur le
ladies
secrétaire
and
d'État
gentlemen,
Blinken,
Mr.
je
Secretary
voudrais
of State,
avant tout, au
first
nom
and
du président
foremost,
Macky
on
Sall,
behalf of my
président
President
en
Macky
exercice
Sall,
de l'Union
who is
africaine,
the helm
vous
of the
remercier
African
très
Union, I would like to
particulièrement
thank you
de
very
l'invitation
specifically
que vous
for
nous avez adressée
inviting
et de
us
l'appel urgent
here
que vous
today
nous
and
avez
for the
lancé
urgent
afin de
appeal
prendre à bras le corps
so
la
that we
grave et
may
lancinante
tackle
question de la
this
sécurité
very
alimentaire mondiale.
serious and long-standing
Je voudrais
question
tout aussi
of
saluer
food
l'engagement de
security.
Monsieur le
I
secrétaire
would
général
like
Guterres
to
pour
welcome
les
the
causes nobles
commitment
qu'il
by
défend
Secretary
en
General
vue de promouvoir
Guterres
un monde solidaire,
to
uni
promote
dans la paix et dans la sécurité.
a
Il y a encore
world
quelques
that
jours,
is
Monsieur le
united in
secrétaire
peace
général,
and
vous le rappeliez
security.
lors de votre
A few
passage à
days
Dakar
ago,
pour faire une
you
visite
said
au continent africain et nous
in
l'avons
Dakar this
particulièrement
very
apprécié.
Thing, and we
En ces
really
moments troubles
appreciated
que
your
vit le
comments.
monde, où
In
l'incertitude plane
this
sur notre
difficult
avenir commun,
moment,
des craintes de pénurie
with so
généralisée
much
de denrées
uncertainty
alimentaires
and
et d'intrants
with
agricoles
shortages of
habitent tous
food
les États et tous les
and
peuples, mais
agricultural
notamment
inputs,
ceux d'Afrique.
we're all affected,
C'est donc
but
dire que notre
mostly
rencontre de ce
Africa
jour
is
est
affected.
pertinente,
Our meeting
puisque
today is very
elle doit témoigner de la
pertinent
solidarité
because
dont nous devons faire montre,
it
une
shows that we
solidarité
need
agissante
to have
pour éviter de
solidarity
tomber dans le
and we
gouffre
need
de
to
tous
act
les maux.
together so we do
Ces mots
not
pour
fall
l'Afrique,
into
ils ont pour nom
all of
la
those
famine,
ills.
la
We
malnutrition,
need to fight
la
against
pauvreté,
famine,
la
malnutrition,
dette,
poverty,
les
and
conflits
debt,
armés, les
armed
changements
conflicts,
climatiques, le faible
climate
taux de
change,
vaccination contre la COVID-19,
a lack
pour ne
of
citer que
vaccine
cela.
or few
De ce
vaccinations
point de vue,
against
et vous l'avez dit,
COVID-19. As
la
you
situation
said,
de l'Afrique
the
est plus que
situation in
préoccupante.
Africa is
Mesdames et
more than
messieurs,
concerning.
pour l'Afrique,
Ladies
nous
and
devons faire
gentlemen,
un
for
constat.
Africa, we
Un
need
constat à
to
partir des
note
chiffres qui nous
that,
parlent. Selon
the
la
numbers
FAO,
can show things
257
to us.
millions de personnes souffrent de la faim en
According to
Afrique,
the FAO,
dont
257
237 millions
million people
seulement
suffer from
en
hunger
Afrique
in Africa,
subsaharienne.
and most of them in
Selon le
sub-Saharan
Programme alimentaire
Africa.
mondial,
According to the
la
World Food
sécheresse
Programme,
menace 20 millions
drought
de
is
personnes
threatening 20
de
million
famine dans la
people
corne de
of
l'Afrique.
hunger
La
in the
pandémie
Horn of
Covid
Africa.
a déjà
The COVID
provoqué une
pandemic has
contraction
already
économique de
triggered an
3,2%
economic contraction
et
of
elle a fait basculer
3.2%, and
55
it has
millions
pushed
d'Africains
55 million
dans la
Africans
pauvreté.
into
Parmi
poverty.
les 80
Among
pays en
the
situation
80
d'endettement dans
countries
le
in
monde, la
dependence
majorité
in the
se
world,
trouve en
most of
Afrique.
them
Voilà
are
le
located in
constat
Africa.
que
So
nous
that
devons
is the
faire.
situation
À
that
ce
we must
tableau
deal
sombre
with. And
est
to
venu
this dire
s'ajouter
situation,
les
we
effets
must
de la guerre
add
en
the
Ukraine.
situation of the
Nous
war
vivons
in
donc
Ukraine.
en
We
Afrique une
must
situation
therefore see in
exceptionnelle.
Africa a
Cette
special,
situation
exceptional
nécessite
situation.
des mesures
And the situation
exceptionnelles.
needs
Voilà
exceptional
pourquoi nous
measures.
sommes
This
heureux
is
de
why we
l'invitation
are
que vous nous
very
avez
happy
lancée
that you
à
sent
venir
us this
réfléchir
invitation
avec
to
vous.
think about this
Notre
problem with
conviction,
you.
elle est faite
Our production
que
is
quelles
weak.
que puissent être les difficultés, et vous l'avez dit
Regardless
tous les
of our
deux,
problems, as you
quelles
said,
que
both
puissent
of you,
être les difficultés que
regardless
nous
of the problems
traversons,
that we are
nous avons en
experiencing,
nous-mêmes
we
les
do have
capacités de
within
les
ourselves
surmonter
the
si nous voulons les
capabilities to
surmonter
overcome them
et
if
si
we
nous y
do want to
croyons.
overcome
Et
them
je pense
and
que
if we
nous
do
y
believe in
croyons.
ourselves.
Alors
I
que
do
faire?
believe we believe in
Que
ourselves.
faire après
So
le
what must we
constat?
do? What
L'Afrique
must we do
voudrait
after
vous
this
proposer
observation?
quelques pistes
What
de
do you
solutions.
propose? What type of
La
solutions
première,
are we proposing?
nous pensons
Well, first
que,
of
en
all, we
posant des
believe
actes
that
forts, nous
we
devons
must
contenir par tous les
contain
moyens
by all means
l'inflation.
possible inflation.
L'inflation par un
Inflation
soutien financier
via
multilatéral beaucoup
multilateral
plus
financial
important,
support at a
plus
much greater
concessionnel,
extent.
moins
No
conditionnel.
conditional, less
Cela
conditional,
permettra
and
aux
that will
pays en
allow
développement de
developing
résister
countries to
aux chocs
resist to
économiques,
the economic
financiers.
shock and to the
J'invite
financial
donc
shock.
le
Therefore,
G7,
I
le G20,
invite
le
the G7,
FMI,
the
la Banque
G20,
mondiale
the IMF,
à
the World
réactiver
Bank to
l'initiative de suspension
reactivate
du service de la
the
dette tel que
debt
proposé
suspension
par le groupe de
service
réponse à la crise mondiale
as
que vous avez
mentioned
mis
by
en
the
place,
task force that
Monsieur
you
le secrétaire
established
général,
yourself,
et
Mr.
dont le
Secretary
président
General,
Macky Sall,
and
en
President
sa
Macky
qualité de
Sall,
président de l'Union
as President
africaine,
of the
est un
AU,
des
is
champions.
one of the
Nous
champions.
pensons
We believe
que cette
that
solution
this solution
sera à même
will be
pour nous
capable,
de faire
at least
face
for us,
à la
to
crise
confront
alimentaire
the food
pour
crisis
rééchelonner
in
les
order
échéances
to
de 2
reschedule
à 5 ans.
the debts
La
over
deuxième
5
solution,
years. The
c'est de
second solution
transférer
is
les droits de
to
tirage
transfer
spéciaux
the special
des pays
drawing
riches
rights
aux
from the
pays
rich
africains.
countries
Vous
to
l'avez
African
également
countries.
dit,
You
selon des
also mentioned
modalités
it
à
according
convenir.
to modalities
L'Afrique
that need to be
attend
agreed upon.
650 milliards de dollars.
Africa
Pour le moment,
has
elle n'en a
256 $6 billion.
33.
Well, as of
Le gap
now, we
est
have
donc
only
énorme.
received 33 billion.
La
So
troisième
the
piste de
gap is
solution,
enormous. The
c'est
third
d'encourager
option
les
is
dépenses
to
sociales en
encourage
direction des
social
couches les plus
spending for
vulnérables.
the most
C'est
vulnerable
ce que nous
sectors of
avons
the
fait au
population.
Sénégal.
That is what
Et le
we did in
président Macky
Senegal,
Sall, il y
and
a
President
une
Macky
semaine,
Sall, just
a
a
lancé
week
cet
ago,
important programme
launched this
qui
major
constitue
program
à
which
soutenir
represents
542
an idea
000
of
ménages
supporting
démunis.
supporting
Enfin, et vous l'avez dit, Monsieur le
142,000
Secrétaire général,
poor households.
nous
And as you
devons
said, Mr. Secretary
maintenir
General,
les
we must
chaînes
maintain the
d'approvisionnement
supply
en
chains
céréales
for
ouvertes
grain, and we
pour
must keep them
stabiliser les
open
prix
in order to
et
stabilize
libérer
prices
tous les
and
stocks
to
et les
unleash
mettre
all
à
of
la
the stocks
disposition
and
du
to make
monde.
them available
Cela
to
nous
the entire
permettra
world.
de
And thanks to
bâtir
this, we'll be
une
able to build
résilience forte.
a strong
Il nous
resilience.
faut enfin
We must
agir
finally
maintenant
act
à
right
titre
now
humanitaire.
on a
Vite
humanitarian
et
basis,
maintenant, avant qu'il ne soit trop
now
tard.
before it
C'est
is
la
too
raison
late.
pour laquelle,
This is
et je
why,
termine par là,
and here I will
libérer les
conclude,
stocks de
we
céréales
must
à travers le
unleash
monde,
the stocks
les rendre disponibles
of
et
grain around the
accessibles
world and make them
devient pour
available
nous
and
la
accessible to
première
all.
priorité
This will be
du
our
moment.
first
Au
priority
demeurant,
as of now.
l'Union africaine,
However,
sous
the
la houlette
African
du
Union,
président
under the
Macky Sall,
presidency of
va
Mr. Sall,
consacrer le sommet
will
de Malabo du
dedicate
27
the
mai
Malabo
prochain
Summit
à cette pressante
soon
et
to
fondamentale
this
question.
fundamental and pressing
L'Afrique
issue.
attend de vous.
Africa is
L'Afrique
waiting
attend de
for
la
you.
communauté
Africa is
internationale
waiting from the
et de ses
international community
partenaires
and from
pour
its
un
partners
engagement fort et
to
résolu
show
dans
their
ce
strong
sens. Je vous remercie
commitment.
de votre
Thank you very
attention.
much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Aïssata. It's my pleasure now to give the floor straight from the airplane, I believe, to my good friend Annalena, both in her capacity as the representative from Germany, but also as this year's chair of the G7. Annalena.
Thanks a lot. The plane was a bit late. Secretary General, Secretary of State, dear Tony, Minister, dear Aïssata, Executive Director, dear David Bisley, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. To a starving family in Somalia, to a frightened mother in Yemen, to a hungry school kid in Mali. Russia's war in Ukraine might seem thousands of kilometers away. Its devastating effects, however, are hitting those mothers and fathers, children, and everybody in society directly and with terrible consequences. Russia is not only leading its brutal war with tanks, missiles, and bombs, Russia is leading its war with another terrible but more silent weapon: hunger and deprivation. By blocking Ukrainian ports, by destroying silos, streets, railroads, and especially farmers' fields. Russia has launched a grain war, stocking a global food crisis. It is doing so at a time when millions are already being threatened by hunger, particularly in the Middle East and Africa, due to the devastating effects of the climate crisis, due to the COVID pandemic, due to conflicts raging in their own regions. When I met villagers in Mali and Niger a couple of weeks ago, they told me what it means when the price of grain is doubling on the local market. It means their childs go to bed hungry. It means a family is in pain. The world's poorest are paying the devastating price for Russia's ruthless war. In Mali now the bread costs double than it costed before. In Lebanon, it has raised already by 34%. I would like to tell you from the bottom of my heart, we see your pain, we hear your suffering, and we stand by your side. Three aspects are crucial now. First, we need concrete action. That's why it's important that we reach concrete commitments among G7 partners last week to support Ukraine in keeping up its production and to be able to export the grain which is needed so heavily worldwide. And to step up with aid to those women, men, and children who most urgently need it. Overall, Germany is providing 4 billion euros related to food security this year. But, and this is my second point, we must also look beyond the here and now. The bitter truth is that the global food crisis will not be solved overnight. That's why we must focus on all the factors contributing to hunger. We must tackle the climate crisis. We must help farmers become less vulnerable to droughts, floods, and extreme rains. We must also continue our fight against COVID, making sure nobody is left behind. As G7 foreign ministers, we have just agreed on an action plan to support vaccination campaigns in the global south with almost $4 billion US. We will only succeed, and you've underlined this, if we work together. And this is my third point. That's why I would like to thank you, Tony, for bringing us together today. That's why, Secretary General, we thank you for launching the Global Crisis Response Group, a crucial initiative because this debate needs to be inclusive, with a global reach bringing together donors and those in need. And that's also why we will use our G7 presidency to push this crucial battle. The Global Alliance for Food Security that was initiated by the G7 and will be launched tomorrow is one important step. It will feed into the UN level. Colleagues and friends, don't fall for Russia's disinformation campaign. There are no sanctions, not a single one, on grain exports or fertilizers. There are no sanctions impeding humanitarian aid. Let's be very clear. It's Russia's ruthless war that is putting millions at life and at risk. But we won't stand idle by. We will act. At this time, when an inhuman war is causing such terrible suffering across the globe, that's a matter of responsibility, of solidarity, and of humanity. And that's why we are all here to stand with the poorest. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Vibach, very much. Mr. Secretary General, thank you for starting us off. Greatly appreciate everything you're doing every day on this. Thank you. So now I would like to turn to the Executive Director of the World Food Program, David Beasley. David, the floor is yours.
Is the mic working? There we go. Mr. Secretary, it's great to be with you. Thank you for calling this a very important session. And let me be very clear and to the point. Failure to open the ports will be a declaration of war on global food security, resulting in famine and destabilization of nations, as well as mass migration by necessity. It is absolutely essential that we allow these ports to open, because this is not just about Ukraine. This is about the poorest of the poor around the world who are on the brink of starvation as we speak. So I ask President Putin, if you have any heart at all, to please open these ports. Please assure everyone concerned that the passageways will be clear so that we can feed the poorest of the poor and avert famine, as we've done in the past when nations in this room have stepped up together to the call of action to prevent catastrophe from year after year. It's hard to believe that Ukraine, a nation that grows enough grain to feed 400 million people, is now out of production. Mr. Secretary, it's critical that these farms get back in operation, that the trucks and the trains and the ships move again. The World Food Program, we fed about 130 million people last year, assisted in some way or another. This year, we expect that number to be about 150. 50% of the grains that we buy come from Ukraine. But there's also 7.6 other billion people that depend upon the markets for grain, the commodities that all in this room produce, and the market volatility that has been created by this war is something that the world, in a fragile time like this, after years of conflict, COVID, and climate shocks, the world is too fragile. Mr. Secretary, over 25 nations depend on 50% or more of their grain from this region. Your numbers that you gave and the Secretary General of how much food is produced in this region is a serious matter as it can possibly be. Our operational cost, because of fuel, food price increasing, shipping costs, is already increased over $71 million per month. That means we will be feeding 4 million less people in a time where there's unprecedented increase in global food insecurity. When I started this job just 5 years ago, there were 80 million people marching to starvation. Not chronic hunger, that's another number. It jumped right before COVID to 135. COVID comes along with the economic ripple effect. Of course, you've got to ask the question, why did it jump? It was war and conflict and climate shock. And then COVID comes along with economic devastation of the poorest of the poor countries. $30 trillion or more economic stimulus packages passed. We thought that COVID would be behind us, only to see it ripple again and again and again. And the poorest of the poor countries don't have the safety net finances that they need because they're in so much debt now. It's a very, very fragile time on planet Earth. The world is on fire. We have solutions. We need to act, and we need to act now. The silos are full. Why are the silos full? Because the ports are not operating. Why are the ports not operating? Because there's a blockade that will not allow the food that will feed the world to pass. The farmers need to be back in the field. We need to get those silos empty, but we can't do it without the ports being operational. So, Mr. Secretary, I do want to say a special thanks to the United States, and I say this from the bottom of my heart. I have seen Democrats and Republicans fight over everything, but this week when I saw them coming together for extraordinary cooperation on international food security and humanitarian response to the Ukraine crisis, it warms my heart and gives me hope. And many of you in this room have been stepping up for the last few years. Thank you very much, but there are others in this room that need to step up more than you have. The world is on fire. Don't be penny wise and pound foolish at a time like this. Germany did a very simple study just a year ago that showed in the Syrian crisis with 1 million refugees that ended up in Germany. And guess what? Refugees don't want to leave home. But if they don't have food to any degree of peace, they would do what every single person in this room would do as a mom and dad. They would leave to get that peace. But those 1 million that we could have fed inside Syria for 50 cents a day ended up for $125 billion at over $70 a day inside Germany. In the United States, we're now facing 5 times the number of people talking about migrating from Central America toward the United States border. Just in the past year, that number has increased that much. So it's going to cost us if we don't respond strategically and effectively. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention, and thank you for your leadership every single day, really on the front lines of this crisis. I'd now like to give the floor to the representative from Yemen.
السيد أنتوني بلينكن وزير خارجية الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية الصديقة، أصحاب المعالي الوزراء، السيد أنطونيو غوتيريس الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، السيدات والسادة، اسمحوا لي في البداية أن أسجل شكري لحكومة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية والسيد بلينكن على الدعوة لهذا الاجتماع الهام الذي أتمنى أن يخرج بنتائج عملية ناجعة، خصوصا وأن هذا الاجتماع يدعو الدول الأكثر تضررا والدول الأكثر قدرة على التأثير في موضوع الأمن الغذائي، لتبني دعوة للتحرك في مواجهة الآثار الإنسانية الناجمة عن الأمن الغذائي مع التركيز على الجهود الإنمائية طويلة الأمد لتعزيز
as a result of this conflict and to increase the resiliency to reach a better future that eradicates hunger. And on top of that is sustainable development.
لا يزال الجوع الشديد وسوء
التغذية يمثلان عقبات رئيسية أمام التنمية في العديد من البلدان لا سيما تلك التي تعاني من النزاعات. في هذا السياق اسمحوا لي أن أتحدث عن الوضع في بلادي كأحد أكثر الدول تضرراً والتي تعيش الأزمة الإنسانية الأسوأ بحسب تصنيف الأمم المتحدة وفقاً بتحليل التصنيف المرحلي المتكامل للأمن الغذائي الIPC الصادر عن منظمة الأغذية والزراعة الأمم المتحدة يحتاج أكثر من 24 مليون يمني إلى المساعدة الإنسانية 4 million Yemenis need help and 20 million face hunger. The
هذه الصورة
level of
القاتمة للوضع
malnutrition
في اليمن
amongst women and
للأسف
children
هي
is very
نتيجة
high.
الحرب
This dark
التي شنتها الميليشيا
picture
الحوثية على
in
الشعب
Yemen
اليمني
is a result
منذ
of the
العام
Houthi
2014
malicious actions in Yemen since year 2014, and so understanding the reasons of suffering and hunger in Yemen is a main way to understand the solution or look for it. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, the truce reached by the envoy of the United Nations Secretary General gave a window of hope for Yemenis, and the government continues to cooperate and show flexibility to achieve a level of alleviating the suffering of Yemenis and cooperating with the United Nations and humanitarian aid organizations and trade, enabling Yemenis to move in and out of the country. And we do not want to see this window shut in the face of Yemenis due to the transience of the Yemeni Houthi militias and their insistence to achieve political gains and violating the truth and opportunities of achieving peace and ending war. Ladies and gentlemen, Yemen suffers from many factors that complicate the issue of food insecurity, and it is aggravated today due to the effects of the world food markets due to the conflicts around the world, especially the conflict in Ukraine. Yemen imports a lot of its food needs from Russia and Ukraine, and as such, its fragile situation is easily impacted by any instability in the international markets. And so we stress the need to pay close attention to the countries that suffer food insecurity and give them greater attention to avoid famine and disaster that are difficult to confront. And in our meeting today, with the initiative to confront food insecurity, there is a number of possibilities. Number one, to pressure Houthis to stop their violations of the truth and put the humanitarian needs first and foremost, and going with a goodwill into negotiations to bring peace in Yemen. Solutions should be long-term and focus mainly on improving resiliency to the most vulnerable groups and to gradually get rid of monetary assistance. And here we stress on the need to connect both social and humanitarian aspects and increasing resiliency through all programs and humanitarian interventions. To achieve that, we should work with governments and beneficial governments to increase their capacities, their technical abilities, and reaching technological solutions to improve the national economy and creating employment opportunities. We should work to support less developed countries, particularly those who are living through conflict or post-conflict, and to deal with the climate change, as well as dealing with the COVID pandemic. The invite to act should be inclusive to bring a global movement to avoid the results of wars and conflicts and to ensure the flow of supply chains and to counter inflation and price increases. We should give priority to Yemeni wheat importers to reach the markets and to ensure that areas that are subject to the danger of famine can resist and remain active. And in the light of the great drop in the Yemeni Riyal's value against USD, we should create a special fund and special program to fund Yemeni imports to enable Yemeni importers of wheat to find the working capital and to fund imports from international markets, to establish a new system that extends terms of payment between importers and international exporters to 60 days under the purview of an international financial organization. Finally, to exempt countries that suffer from humanitarian crises
مؤخرا.
from the
شكراً
export
جزيلاً.
exemptions by some countries. Thank you very much.